Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Erika Sigurdson and this is Making History. In our last video, we talked about medieval universities, and I was struck, again, by how much the 21st century university has in common with its 13th century ancestor. Some of that is a little superficial, obviously. Things like, titles, the rectors and deans and bachelors. But other similarities are, I think, so deeply ingrained in our culture that we even struggle to name them. Things like how we learn, how we structure knowledge, and how we identify experts in our field. But I was also struck, again, by what a male-dominated institution the medieval university was. So I thought I'd balance out that frat boy energy from our last video by focusing this week on women and women's education. Were there even educated women in the Middle Ages? And what did it mean to be an educated woman? And what did it mean and what does it matter to be an educated woman in a culture dedicated to excluding women from this concept of learned? So in or around the year 1200, a girl named Beatrice was born into a merchant family in Flanders, so the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. She was educated by her mother at home until the age of 7. She was, according to her biographer, a bit of a prodigy and had memorized the Psalms in Latin in order by the age of 5. When she was only 7, though, her mother died, and her father sent her to live with a community of religious women in a nearby town where she attended the local grammar school, which was a co-educational facility run by the municipality. She returned home after only a year, but her experience with the religious community would shape the course of her life. Between the ages of 10 and 15, Beatrice studied at a convent school in a Cistercian convent named Florival. She entered as an oblate, so oblates were children who were given to the monastery, but not yet old enough to commit to becoming a monk or a nun. At 16, Beatrice was accepted as a novice at Florival, and shortly after that, she was sent for 1 year's further education, what we might call like a technical training, to a different convent. There she learned the art of writing and illustrating manuscripts, especially devotional books. Beatrice became the first abbess of a new convent called Nazareth, like in the Bible, but located in northern Belgium. There she attracted students of her own, and Nazareth became a well-known school for local girls. But in her time, Beatrice was best known as a powerful figure in this growing religious movement. She was a mystic, meaning that she experienced these very powerful visions and these intense religious experiences where she knew God. And she was given this knowledge about her faith in the world directly and through this sensory, emotional, religious experience. And she tried to convey that knowledge, to teach others what she had been shown through what was one of the first works of mystic literature, a text that she wrote in Middle Dutch, not in Latin, called The 7 Ways of Holy Love. And you know what I think is kind of funny? Is that if you think about it, the 7 Ways of Holy Love, it's a listicle, like we did last week. I mean, not really. Obviously, it's a short treatise that describes the role of love for God and the divine in her spiritual journey. And she identifies 7 ways or types of love. She identifies this progression in her eternal experience of feeling love from this early infatuation to despair, frustration, and then a mature, mutual feeling. So I want to use the example of Beatrice of Nazareth to think about some of the opportunities, but also contradictions, around education for women in the Middle Ages. But before we get into it, we have to address the elephant in the room. We have to talk about a modern idea getting in the way of us understanding medieval women and the education of medieval women on their own terms. So what do I mean? Almost immediately after the Middle Ages, writers and thinkers from the so-called Renaissance were telling this story about the exceptional abuse and mistreatment of women from the time before them. They called this period the Middle Ages, and they imagined it as this horrible wasteland between ancient world, great, awesome, super good feminists, and themselves, the Renaissance, great, awesome, super good feminists, the rebirth of culture and civilization. And even then, in the friggin' Renaissance, they narrativized and mythologized this supposedly horrific mistreatment of women, especially at the hands of despotic feudal lords, and especially difficult for our current purposes, the church. I mean, post-medieval fantasies about the Middle Ages are so keen on imagining the tyranny and the ignorance and the intellectual control of the power of the church. It makes it really hard to talk about the actual situation in the actual Middle Ages. So here's the challenge. As I've been describing, we have, and have had since the Renaissance, a really distorted, incorrect view on the role and treatment of women, especially in the Middle Ages. It's this like shocking, sensationalized, caricature almost of the abuse and oppression of women. Ask me why I never got into Game of Thrones, for example. And it's not true. But I don't want to suggest and sit here and try and tell you that there was no sexism in the Middle Ages. I don't even think that medieval Europe was less sexist or misogynist than this modern caricature would have you believe. But when we look at the actual sources, when we immerse ourselves in the actual worldview of the Middle Ages, I think it's more accurate to say that it was just differently sexist. And it's important to know and notice this because one major difference between what we see in the sources and what we see in this like distorted pop culture view of medieval misogyny is the reality tends to look a lot more like our own world, a lot more human. That being said, it is also true that medieval people, and I'm generalizing here massively, did hold more openly sexist views of women than things that we're used to hearing today. Medieval medical theory, heavily influenced by Aristotle, explicitly taught that the female body, including the mind, was a lesser, weaker inverse of the male. Women supposedly aged faster, died earlier, and lacked heat, right? This kind of essential vitality that was the basis of health and strength and intelligence, like all the positive human characteristics. And then, beyond medical misogyny, we have theology. Medieval Christianity taught very explicitly that women were more sinful than men. Women were less disciplined, more easily led astray by our bodies and our desires. And because of this, while equal in salvation in some kind of nebulous future way, the church taught, following St. Paul, that wives should be subject to their husbands. Even in cases where a wife wanted to make a charitable donation to the church, they upheld this principle and insisted that without her husband's permission, she couldn't do that. Legally and morally, a wife couldn't give money or property to the church. Their favorite thing to get, because her choices and her property were subordinate to her husband. Okay, with that depressing beginning, let's talk about basic education for girls and women. So the foundation of girls' education in the Middle Ages was firstly preparing them for their adult responsibilities, and secondly, providing them with a foundation of religious knowledge. Even the most misogynist theologians thought that girls needed to have basic religious education, meaning a knowledge of common prayers and psalms. It also meant training in the Christian virtues for women, especially chastity, modesty, obedience, humility, and courtesy, being polite and nice. So this means that early religious training was also training girls to be subservient. They were exposed early and often to this misogynist theology. St. Paul and all the other authorities, the church fathers and saints, explicitly and repetitively would expound on women's sinfulness and inferiority. By the late Middle Ages, when literacy started to be more widespread, learning to read became more of a useful foundation for religious participation. And girls' education might also include learning to read homilies, liturgical works, maybe especially the lives of female saints. Reading, together with numeracy and basic arithmetic, were also potentially necessary skills in adulthood for women who might be asked to assist their husband or even take over the management of an estate or a business while he, for example, off on crusade for years, maybe ever. Other more practical skills for girls would depend on their social status, but were likely to include running a household of varying size and complexity. Like for a noblewoman or royal wife, running a household would be like managing a Hilton, or actually really like a small chain of hotels, because the family would move around between their various estates. Before we continue, we have to do the tricky work of defining our terms and deciding what we think counts as education within this context. In the Middle Ages, the vast majority of young people were learning on the job, and they learned by observing and attempting to imitate the example of an older mentor. This is the basis of the apprentice system, but it went significantly beyond the trades that we might associate with apprenticeship. You learned how to be a knight by being a squire. You learned how to be a lady by serving as a lady's maid, or a foster daughter within an aristocratic household. Is that an education? These secular learners may or may not have been literate, and they certainly weren't sitting in a classroom day after day memorizing Virgil or parsing Latin grammar. And I would say that in a medieval, particularly clerical understanding, they were not. considered educated. Or rather, they might be educated sufficiently to their station, educated what they needed to know to be good Christians and perform properly their role in society, but they weren't learned. So what did it mean to be learned or even literate in a medieval society? So to a lot of clerical writers, to be highly educated, to be learned, was really just synonymous with being a cleric. Don't get me wrong. Clerical writers were certainly able to identify, for instance, a wise and educated king or noblewoman. But what they meant by that was educated to their station for their role in society. To be learned, to be highly educated, meant having a very specific set of technical and analytical skills focused on the church and later the universities. There are so many domains of human knowledge that a medieval scholastic, medieval cleric, would not have identified as learning. Some you'd expect, like sewing or masonry or whatever, but also a ton that you might not expect. Things like history, politics, foreign languages, literature, poetry, none of that. To be learned, to be lettered, the Latin term was literatus, it meant educated in a clerical environment. It meant proficiency in Latin, familiarity with the canon, which included writers from antiquity and also church fathers. It meant facility with logic and rhetoric, and a particular formal way of constructing an argument. But all of this was only accessible, at least in full, to men of the church. And more informally, in their rhetoric, clerical writers simply defined being learned or being lettered as being a cleric. So we get this common expression from the Middle Ages, clericus et laicus, meaning clerics and laypeople, which is a way of saying everybody, kind of like the modern ladies and gentlemen. But another way of saying this, a full synonym, was to say literati et illiterati, the literate and the illiterate. In Old Norse, they split the difference, actually, and say learned and lay people, lærðir og leikir, to really illustrate how fluid those concepts are. Learned means clerical, layperson means illiterate. So to be learned is to be a cleric. And since only men are clerics, this excludes all women from the identity of learned or highly educated, with the only partial exception of nuns. So let's talk about nuns. So what then is a highly educated woman in the Middle Ages? So one thing that can trip up a modern observer is this fact that in medieval Europe, an educated woman was, by and large, a religious woman. This was also largely true of men, as we've been talking about, but cleric is an identity that can cover a lot of different roles, with more or less interaction with or power over the world and other people. For women, there was one option, and it was the convent. So I want us to be careful here, because nowadays, and especially in a Protestant Anglophone tradition, I think we sometimes think of convents in the past as like this kind of prison for women, a way to punish or hide away uppity girls. And I'm not saying that's never happened, but for intellectually oriented women or women who, for any reason, struggled to fit into society, convents were a refuge. They were a resource, a place where intelligent, especially philosophically or intellectually minded women could focus on a life of the mind. But at the same time, the monastic environment did tend to foster this very different intellectual tradition than, say, the universities. Male or female, monastics were expected to stay inside the walls of their convents, away from the real world. And don't get me wrong, universities very quickly developed their own form of ivory tower and became very focused on intellectual debates and hypotheticals that had very little to do with the real world. But the culture of monasticism really stayed away from the ego-driven, combative debate format that was quickly going to dominate university intellectual life. Monks are not supposed to crush their opponents with facts and logic. Neither were women, for that matter, because women were being taught to be humble, remember? It's interesting, actually, to think about the extent to which the scholastic model of intelligence, where intelligence meant winning debates, attacking your opponent's argument, trying to dominate them and win. I mean, even just that by itself probably would have kept women away from the universities, even if they weren't being actively shut out. And so it's no surprise that monks and nuns in this time period became interested in very different intellectual questions than the scholastics. And they went about exploring those ideas in ways that didn't necessarily look like the structured, analytical dialectics of university scholarship. And this was the intellectual tradition that women could be part of when they were very much shut out of the world of scholastic learning. In the words of one scholar of talking about learned women in the Middle Ages, women were often highly educated, but at the same time we have to realize that the large majority of them lived in a different world from that of the textually learned. So this is what I like about Beatrice. I find her example really fascinating on two levels. In the first place, because we have all these details of her early life and education, we can see in pretty clear detail a relatively standard but excellent education for girls of her time, her class, and her religious interests. Beatrice managed to attend pretty much all of the educational options that were available to girls at the time: homeschool, convent school, and a coeducational elementary or grammar school in the town. She doesn't attend any of the universities that were coming to being in this time period, or even a cathedral school, which would also have provided more advanced education in logic and theology and formal rhetoric. But those were never an option for her as a woman. But she went as far into a religious education as any woman could go. She was fluently reading and copying Latin. She apparently owned a copy of a book on the Trinity. Her life doesn't say explicitly, but scholars have speculated that this might be St. Augustine's De Trinitate, which is, not an easy read. All of this is to say, she was an educated woman. And at the same time, the second thing I find fascinating about her is her orientation towards mysticism and experiential knowledge. The mystics were in many ways the opposite kind of thinkers to the university-trained scholastics. The scholastics emphasized logic and reason. They promoted this very, dispassionate logic bro approach to knowledge and learning. But mystics, on the other hand, didn't care at all about your logic. To a mystic, knowledge wasn't based in reason, wasn't analytical, argued, debated. Knowledge was mainly affective, firstly, meaning tied to emotion. It was felt and experienced. And even more radically, knowledge, to a mystic, honestly had very little to do with education. Very little to do with things like hard work and study and a linear progress, with the discipline of learning, the way it was being taught and reified at the universities. Knowledge, to a mystic, was a gift given by God. It could be given to the most educated, literate master of theology, or it could be given to a shepherd girl. God doesn't always care. And Beatrice's book, The 7 Ways of Love, fully exemplifies this. It's quite literally entirely about the centrality of love and yearning for the divine. So on the one hand, it's tempting to lean into the obvious interpretation and say, well, of course, mysticism appealed to women, the uneducated and rural people, who were being shut out of intellectual life, and even of their own religion, by the universities and the scholastics. And I think there's some truth in that. But I worry that by saying this, we're kind of perpetrating the same hierarchy of knowledge. This idea that scholastic knowledge is better and mysticism was just the dregs that people shut out of power had access to. And I don't think that's quite true. Because mysticism also identifies some important gaps in scholastic knowledge, like emotion. The scholastic tradition and its descendants are not very good at understanding and valuing emotion and connection and feeling. 7 kinds of love, the gradations of that one emotion and the implication of that for the knowledge and salvation. They weren't doing that. Together with emotion, mystics focused on things like personal experience and the power of metaphor and sensory experience. Those things are powerful tools for conveying knowledge and molding people's beliefs. They're visceral, they're tangible, and they are largely ignored by scholastics. So you can see why some medievalists have been really fascinated by mysticism and how, in some ways anyway, it seems to play with or flip gender roles inside this very patriarchal institution of the medieval church. I should also say quickly that there are people who've looked at mysticism also from a perspective of almost gender fluidity or queer identity within the mystic experience. But that's maybe a different topic. There are even those who will read women writers, and especially mystics, female mystics, almost through this modern, post-colonial lens, by which I mean reading them as a kind of subaltern group, a class of people who, from birth, were trained to believe in their own inherent inferiority and to accept a subordinate role in society, but who, through their work and through their writing, were trying to find their own authentic voice, but still working within this very limiting framework. Anyway, it's time to wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for listening all the way through, if you're here. I've been really enjoying making these videos and getting to dig into medieval culture and society. Let me know in the comments if there's any topics that you'd really like me to focus on. Next week, I'm going to wrap up my tour of education through the social ranks with a video on learning to become a knight. So watch out for that soon. And in the meantime, if you missed my last video about university life, you could check that out here. And for now, stay curious, stay open, and do good history. Thanks, bye-bye.